One of the first questions, if not the first, we need to ask our customers is the number and the type of dogs that will be traveling with them. In other words, asking about the size. I usually advise against asking for size in terms of small, medium, or large because it's quite subjective. I would rather go for an objective value like the weight of the dog. That can definitely give us a much more useful indication on what type of dog is traveling with our customers. This is very useful to try to identify the best solution to offer to the customer based precisely on the necessary space. So if we know that there's a large dog staying, let's say 30 to 40 kilos in weight, we will offer a room with more space. A dog that's smaller in size needs less space, obviously. So in order to ensure a pleasant and comfortable stay for our customers, we must take into account this aspect. Another aspect is whether the dog is used to sleeping in a crate or not, because obviously the crate also has space requirements that we need to take into account. If it's a large dog, a crate can take up a lot of space, even 2 or 3 square meters. So even in this case, asking if the dog sleeps in the crate can help us understand the space that we need to assign for the overnight stay of the dog. Another question that we can ask, more related to the everyday life of the dog rather than the space, is if the dog has problems walking. For example, up and down the stairs. In this case, it's useful to ask because if, for example, we have a customer with an elder dog or a dog with physical issues and we have to choose which room to give them, we might need this information because it might be that we cannot assign a room on the first or second floor even if we have an elevator, because not all dogs are willing to enter one. So there are people that are quite constrained in this regard because they can't get on an elevator and sometimes they can't go on the stairs either. Sometimes it can happen that they can't get into an elevator but can go on the stairs, or vice versa, can't go on the stairs but can enter an elevator. So it's important to understand these dynamics, get informed, and eventually choose the best room to assign. Another thing we could ask regarding the services that we can provide is about the type of diet that the dog follows. There are now more and more people who are assigning a homemade diet to their dog. This obviously also entails the potential presence of services to be provided to the owners, but it's useful for us to organize the type of services that we could offer, of course. Another thing, if dogs are more sensitive to noises, we should assign a room located at the back, possibly off the hallway, rather than one facing the elevator. This is because if the dog is attentive, it will easily get alerted by noises, so placing it in front of a busy area with a lot of people passing, such as staff and other guests, can get it quite agitated, and that could mean barking, go on alert, crying, etc. Instead, it would be better if the owner could just tell us, look, he is quite sensitive, so it's better that we stay in a more isolated area. So this is definitely another aspect to take into consideration. Finally, another very useful question to ask is if the dog is able to stay alone in the room. Depending on the service policies of the establishment, the dog may potentially access all the facilities. But for example, if we have a wellness center rather than a restaurant where the dog is not allowed, or spaces or moments in general when the dog needs to stay in the room, we must ensure that the dog is able to experience this moment in a serene manner. If this were not the case, we can potentially equip ourselves with specific services and evaluate what we can offer to our customers. However, knowing this really makes the difference. Finally, the last element to evaluate when assigning a room concerns specifically the room's furnishings. So it's worth asking if the dog can stay alone in the room and if the dog has particular issues in the room we assigned, because it can have any kind of needs and any kind of dynamics that we need to know about in order to choose the right room and the right type of accommodation for this type of customer. The main service, the one that I always start with, is the one of true hospitality. With that I mean, when welcoming people traveling with a dog, you should do it aware of the choice that you've made at the level of hospitality, and therefore ensuring that their stay is comfortable and that people truly feel welcomed. This is the service that more than anything makes a difference, and that's what distinguishes a truly dog-friendly facility from the rest. So that's always the starting point. The other services are something extra that we can provide, but the foundation is genuine hospitality. As for more specific services, if we look at what we can offer inside the room, the basics that now many facilities are providing are bowls and pillows. These amenities are definitely useful, but let's consider, however, that not all of our guests will use them because many dogs do not sleep on a pillow that is not theirs because of the smell. That's, for example, because they can have the smell of other dogs attached to it, or they can lack their own smell, or simply because of habits. Maybe they are used to their crate or have other habits in general. You should still keep some as a backup, so if someone were to forget theirs, you can offer them. It's a good service, it's definitely not the main service, but it's something that you can offer nonetheless. Another very important service is having a refrigerator in the room. This is because there are now many customers who have their own homemade diet for their dog and might need to store food. If we don't have this option, because of our rooms are not equipped with this kind of appliance, something that can be done is to still give the option for people to store it in a common fridge or our own fridge that we have in the facility. If we don't have this option because our rooms are not equipped with this kind of appliance, something that can be done is to still give the option for people to store it in a common fridge or in our own fridge that we have in the facility. So they will bring the food directly to us managers and we'll be the ones to store it for them. Obviously, in this case, we should ask that the food is well portioned, well labeled, and that it complies with all the relevant health authority regulations for food storage within the accommodation facility. Another service I recommend offering in a room is a blanket. There are some dogs that are used to sleeping on beds or sofas. It is true that we can establish rules for our customers in order to prevent dogs from getting on beds or sofas. But what I can tell you in reality is that if a dog is used to this kind of solution, it is practically impossible that it won't bring it along even on vacation. Even if the owner is vigilant about the fact that the dog doesn't climb on the bed, as soon as the owner leaves, the dog will tend to climb up. So what we can do, if necessary, and what I always recommend anyway, is to provide a blanket for guests. Therefore, establish a rule stating that perhaps it's not allowed, but if the owner knows that there's no alternative to this, at least ask them to use the blanket that we provide as an option. I always recommend blankets that are either made of microfiber or thick and easily washable, so that even in terms of fur, they don't retain too much, and at the same time, they don't create particular problems in maintenance and washing. The blanket should be already available at arrival so that the guests find it in the room. This way, if they were to forget it, although usually customers always bring it with them, it's available nonetheless for them. So we assure that it's a clean blanket and that they place it on the bed, and potentially this way we will limit the expense for washing a duvet, which usually can be quite high. Managing dogs in a restaurant setting does involve dynamics to pay attention to, but it's also fairly simple in terms of implementation and space management. If we don't have, for example, a specific room, we can potentially create a space using dividers, screens, or other measures. This way, we can provide an area, obviously adjacent to the restaurant, with some tables dedicated to those who want to dine with their dogs or have lunch with them. This, of course, happens if we don't want to use the entire restaurant area. The space we need to save from specifically the presence of dogs, however, is certainly that of the buffet if we have to set up one. In this case, it's obviously important that in this area dogs don't approach or linger around, so potentially the area dedicated to people who have a dog should be located away from the buffet, or my advice is always at the back of the room. I say the back of the room, firstly to distance ourselves from the buffet, as we said before, but also because the dog will have fewer stimuli. If we place the dog in a high traffic area or noisy area, many sights and sounds may be triggering. Instead, in corners or in more secluded areas, there's more control over the dog and over the situation overall, so it can relax more. As for the table arrangement, my advice is to provide adequate spaces between them nonetheless. Obviously, this avoids having dogs too close to each other, also because there are in this case shared resources like food, so there's a risk that dogs might compete if they're too close, if simply a piece of bread falls, for example. So if we have adequate space between one table or another, this problem doesn't arise. Additionally, the last advice I usually give is to establish a regulation regarding these environments. Some rules should be common sense, but it's always better to specify them in order to avoid any kind of problems. So, for example, the fact of not giving food from one's own plate or from different bowls to the dog should be one. This is partly related to the issue of resources, as we mentioned earlier, but also for the issue of respect towards other people in the same room. So it's not correct that they might eventually see situations they are not comfortable with and that they might not accept. So, what I always recommend is to create a regulation that includes what can be done and what cannot be done, assuming indeed that there should also be a bit of common sense from the people. The piece of advice I give is first of all to identify the most appropriate time of the day. This should already be evaluated by the owners themselves, but also by us. If we want to offer this kind of services, we must take into account that dogs have specific needs and have health risks that are different from ours. So definitely, if it's summer, avoid proposing guided tours accessible to dogs in the oddest hours of the day. I personally would advise a guide to impose a ban, precisely to fundamentally protect the dog at certain times. So if the owner hasn't thought about it, we are a bit forcing him to say, don't do the guided tour at 12, but we'll do it tonight at 6 p.m. or in the morning at 9 a.m. when the weather is cooler. I decide to accept dog inside of my guided tours, but I do it only when there are safe situations for them. Another thing we can foresee is the presence of water points for the dog, which can be useful. It's true that the owner should always have a bottle or some water supply for their own dog, but on very hot days, the dog may need to drink a lot more, and therefore it's important to know when and where we pass by a fountain or a point where we can fill a water bottle or the bowl, or where the dog can get wet for a second and cool down. Because sometimes even choosing the right time of the day is not enough. So this is a very important service that we can potentially include in our guided tour. Lastly, another element to consider related to guided tours is the structure of the tour itself, which is different if we have dogs or not. Dogs indeed suffer a lot from static positions. When the guided tour includes long breaks where the guide explains, this could lead the dog to stressful situations like barking or being restless. So it's better to plan a tour that includes more but shorter breaks, like 2, 3, 5 minutes maximum, where the guide explains and then the group gets moving again. If we can ensure movement for the dog, it allows for a more comfortable situation for them. Even the locations where we stop to give the explanations should be evaluated. So it would be better not to stop near busy roads because there are many noises, many stimuli, or in areas with heavy traffic where other dogs might pass by. If instead we find an area that is more quiet, perhaps a bit more isolated, it's definitely better. The dog owner surely can focus on listening to our explanation rather than being focused on avoiding that the dog gets stressed. The starting point is the regulation fundamentally, so what people can do and what they cannot do with their dog. It must be a regulation drafted in a way that is clear. That means it must not be a civil code difficult to read and interpret. Very clear rules, specific, in which we report precisely what can be done and the environments that are accessible. Clear information from the outset prevents us from potential problems during the stay. Another thing, of course, is to specify the services, and that also should be conveyed in a very clear manner. Another thing, of course, is to specify the services. This should also be conveyed in a very clear manner. I usually advise to already report prices and specifics so that customers can make appropriate evaluations and then decide if a service is free or if a service is paid and what is the related cost for that. Another information that we can provide is the contact of a vet. I usually always recommend this to those who travel with a dog. When we do our part of promotion or when we organize our trips, we already anticipate the contact of a local vet. And for those who want to travel alone and choose the accommodation independently, we always recommend before going to the chosen facility to look for a vet. This is because in case the owners were to find themselves in situations of danger or need, having the contact already at hand is very convenient, rather than having to search for it in a moment of stress and alarm. So, if it's the facility itself that provides a vet, perhaps they already have the chance to get to know them. They know that they are a trusted doctor and so on. So this is definitely a service much appreciated and very useful to provide to our customers, and possibly already specifying it on the website can be important. Otherwise, we can also specify that in the confirmation email if we know that the dog is coming.